Welcome back, everybody, and thanks for waiting. Yes, Mr. Kelber's keynote is definitely worth the wait, so I'm very happy to give the stage to him, because as Susanne just told us, he'll be kicking off our privacy conference this year with his thoughts and his perspective on international data transfers, which is definitely the topic that we'll be speaking most about during this day and tomorrow. So, Professor Kelber, it's very great of you to take the time to join us today, and yeah, we're very great that you're giving us your perspective on international data transfers and therefore setting the scene somewhat for our first day.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for the interest in that topic, which is a still remaining one in all the conferences I'm a member of, and the pandemic crisis has proven to be a lasting chance in our daily lives, but complaining about the many hardships does not. Is there a problem with the? No. Is there a problem with the volume? No. Okay, fine. And there are some lasting lessons from that crisis that have not only arisen with Corona, but we see that the digitization has been woefully neglected in companies, administrations, education, health sector. And now we have some changes appearing at the same time, like the international data transfer, a lack on digitization, the ideas of new technologies with new problems and risks and chances to see it. At this point, I would not like to talk about past failings, but about the idea of how data protection could drive digitization to combine protection of people and economic success. This succeed when data protection is transmitted into good products. And I compare that sometimes with the idea of how economy, ecology can be combined. And this is debate happens in Europe. And it's one of the basic questions behind the international data transfer, because some people say that the idea of getting rid of the problems of international data transfer could be to cut some of the ideas of data protection and privacy in Europe on an international standard. Some governments, especially in time of crisis, always have a great temptation, of course, always for the good of people and solution of the problems, to cut back people's fundamental rights in order to develop real or supposed solutions in a very specific way. So that stems from the old misconception of overcoming crisis, of international standards by the lowest example, and to solve the problems quickly by authoritarian or liberal means, or libertarian means. So the pandemic is not over yet, but after 18 months, the first conclusion can be drawn. There is no need of bypassing fundamental rights, not for fighting a pandemic and not for economic success. And these both fronts, these both struggles are those we are in these days at the European level. To have a close look to the pandemic before going into some of the guidelines and debates about the international data transfer, these days we've seen that there is no single point where any solution for fighting the pandemic has been failed to the veto of data protection supervision. And this is important even for the debate about international data transfer, because sometimes the vision of people in the data-driven economy to combine the value of privacy, the meaning of fundamental rights with economic success is so low expressed that they only show us the idea of really copying different ideas of how to handle personalized data. We see the same idea in the pandemic crisis as in the international data transfer. It is true that the GDPR has achieved a great deal nationally in Europe and worldwide to change the idea of how to deal with the personal data on cross-border transfers. However, it seems to be the case that limiting the power of dominant US technology companies and in future of Chinese technologies or from other countries, it will remain the unresolved challenge for a long time. So it was a long time, it was binded on a national or just inner European debate. And the GDPR should actually provide a toolbox for the supervisory authorities to protect people's right to self-determination, which is laid down the data protection law. And all European supervisory authority must therefore finally make better use of these cooperation procedures to have a common level on enforcement, a common level of rules, and really one face to the customer, seeing the customer as people, but even the companies which are in the idea of cross-border data transfer. With regard to large international data groups, it is therefore more than annoying that in Europe, it was only possible to decide one of the group's problematic behaviors in terms of data protection law. This is because the supervisory authorities, which are the leading supervisory authorities in these special cases, has too small resources, too complex national procedural law to really act on these important cases, which will be the basic for the understanding of data protection in Europe, and therefore the basic for international data transfer too. If you do not see an achieved to close these legal proceedings, spanning for almost 3 years against Facebook, Amazon, and co at national level, and then within the framework of consultations within the European Data Protection Board, we can largely write off the reputation and acceptance of the whole set of rules. And that means the understanding of which rules has to apply on international transfer too. Much needs to change, especially in the implementation of European data protection law. By the way, in order to be able at all to set limits, cooperation between competition protection offices and data protection offices will become increasingly important. The economy is also called upon to take up the international challenge. Right now in the crisis, I see a great opportunity for the economy to finally score with data protection friendly solutions. We will have a market where vendors can put a real weight into the balance. And the market has still too little to offer in order to meet the enormous demand, although business can score with data protection friendly solutions on national, European and global markets. Transparency and a perceptible influence on data protection are imperative prerequisites to win support of population. Why that introduction to the international data transfers? When I speak with European companies or with companies using software of international vendors, sometimes they offer me the only idea of to lower the burdens, to lower the limits of data protection, to repeat work with a solution they found on international markets. And there is too less fantasy on European alternatives, too less fantasy on how to change the way of dealing with that data. We know that data transfers do not stop at borders, and it will not in future, not at the EU's external borders and not on the borders of third countries when they process the data and maybe interact with third and fourth and fifth companies in the row of this data processing. We experience this every day in private or in working life, because data transfers to other countries, or at least to the scope of foreign law, even if servers or hardware or companies are inside Europe, is part of our everyday life. And even if we don't see it at first sight, it still takes place every day. The use of social media profiles, the storage of photos in clouds, email services, office applications, human resource systems. To order in a large web shop is often associated with the data transfer beyond the borders. And all these data are not longer stored locally, but globally. And this is why data protection must not end at the borders. So the GDPR created a set of rules that ensures this protection within the European Union, but it also works beyond that area by incorporating the so-called marketplace principle. Data protection cannot only be limited to individual countries or to a community of states, but must be a global concern. This is precisely why it's important that we look beyond our own noses and have regular exchange with colleagues and at a national and international level for a uniform understanding of the protection of fundamental rights and therefore of data protection. We do that in developments now in Japan, South Korea, Brazil, and we have to do that especially after the Schrems II judgment of the Court of Justice of the European Union. More than a year ago now, which was a real thunderbolt with regards to international data transfers. The judgment sends a clear message to all of us, and it's by that mean not only the supervisory authority, but above all the companies. So there can be no adequate level of data protection in the third country if the data subject rights are not protected by adequate safeguards against extensive access rights of security authorities. And this is a change to the scope that only the question how the private company itself processes data is important to the marketplace principle or to the lawfulness of international data transfer. The judgment also stated that not all transfers to third countries are per se inadmissible or impossible. On the contrary, the judgment sets a framework concerning the question whether and to what extent data transfer to third countries can take place through appropriate safeguards within the meaning of GDPR, and if necessary, through additional appropriate measures, the so-called supplementary measures. The judgment also indicates the circumstances to be taken into account in the examination and evaluation. Once again, I should be recalled that the European Union Court of Justice itself has made it very clear that the assessment as to whether a transfer to third countries isn't compliant with data protection depends on the specific circumstances of the individual case. And therefore, the European Data Protection Board cannot provide and will not be able to provide, even in future, a ready-made solution for the question as how to deal with the judgment. At the European level, the EDPB has itself set the task of identifying ways in which data can be transferred in line with data protection law to third countries or to international organizations within the meaning of the GDPR. And last year, the EDPB has produced several substantial contributions with regard to the appropriate safeguards required in the event of transfer to third countries. Several third country related papers are also currently being prepared. In particular, I would like to mention the joint opinion of the EDPB and the European Data Protection Supervisor on the Commission's new standard data protection clauses. The standard data protection clauses are intended to set for the first time a standard that can be used throughout Europe for the contract design, which makes it easier for companies to implement for corresponding provisions of the GDPR. The standard data protection clauses already refer to the requirements of the Schrems II case law. It should be noted that the SDCs alone cannot solve the Schrems II issue, and that an audit requirement remains necessary as to whether the personal data are adequately protected on a case-by-case basis when they are transferred to a third country. The German National Data Protection Conference expressly drew attention to this fact in a separate press release. So the recommendations on the supplementary measures provide assistance in this audit. These recommendations on supplementary measures as a complement to the transfer tools of Chapter 5 of the GDPR, adopted by the European Data Protection Board in June this year, are very important support for assessing and securing international data transfers. These recommendations aim at assisting data exporters in assessing the level of data protection in third countries in order to take appropriate additional measures, depending on the level of protection of the third country, in order to achieve the level of protection required by the GDPR. The recommendations show in 6 steps how this could be possible through additional measures following an assessment of the transfer and the legal situation in the third country. In this context, I want to clarify again, it's important to always examine the specific individual case. There can therefore be the result after an appropriate examinations that a transfer to a third country, which is in line with data protection law, is not possible at all in a certain case. In July 2021, the guidelines on codes of conduct were adopted by the EDPB as a transmission tool too. It's the aim of these guidelines that a code of conduct approved by the competent supervisory authority, following the EDPB's opinion and declared universally valid by the European Commission, may be also used for the processing of personal data. The guidelines are still in the public consultation until October 1st, so there are some few days to get involved with that part. In addition, the EDPB is working on further guideline papers in various expert groups, also dealing with the international data transfer, for example, with regard to the so-called BCRs, the binding corporate rules, but also concerning a possible certification as a transfer tool. In addition to these revised standard data protection clauses, the European Commission also adopted several adequacy decisions with the United Kingdom and Korea to give additional safeguards, additional basis for international data transfer in that countries. It was important to do this with the United Kingdom after the Brexit, because the United Kingdom became a third country. Even there are some objections from the board. We accepted the idea of an adequacy standard, but we think there has to be a monitoring of the development in the United Kingdom when we see that there are some plans, at least plans at the political level, to establish additional legitimate interest of the data processor to process data without a consent or a legal additional legal base. We brought that idea to the Global Privacy Assembly and to the new G7 group, the group of the data protection authorities of the member states of the G7, which met first time this year by initiative on United Kingdom's Data Protection Commissioner Liz Denham, and which has the main theme of data free flow with trust. The idea that especially the large economies of the Western Hemisphere should have a free flow of data among their countries and their law systems, but this is only possible if we have a common high standards of privacy, a high level of protection of fundamental rights for citizens of this group of countries, even in front of security authorities of other countries. A race to the bottom must not happen. In Europe, this would be undoubtedly be stopped by the European Court of Justice, which sets a limit to all these ideas, at least with that Schrems II judgment in last year. To give a glimpse what is going on now with the enforcement of Schrems II, in Germany, the Länder, so the federal states data protection supervisory authorities, have started controls focusing on data transfer by companies to recipients in third countries. As regard the Schrems II judgment, these measures aim at achieving a broad enforcement of the requirements of the European Court of Justice. For my part, I'm also preparing appropriate controls for my area of competence. These controls will start soon too. In this context, it will not be a question of whether a company or public authority has already achieved to organize all data transfers in such a way that they fully comply with the case law of the European Court of Justice. But we will look closely at whether any efforts have started and whether the biggest risks have been eliminated. So that is the state of play, working on guidelines, publishing of guidelines, consultation of guidelines, but enforcement is starting in Germany, in other European Union members, because there is no grace period in the given by the European Court of Justice. But we know that there is time needed for changing specific, important and complex data transfers, explicit and implicit data transfers. So having that debate even after the decision of the European Court of Justice show how important that is for a number of companies, for a number of private persons, and it will be a pre-assessing topic for the next 2 or 3 years, I think. So thank you for that attention at the first place.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kelber, for setting the scene quite nicely and comprehensively, of course, because you already touched upon so many issues of other sessions we'll be having today and tomorrow. We will, of course, be talking to our colleagues from the UK. We will hear more about the enhanced privacy shield in the making later today.